It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert coming to you from Baltimore. U.S. President Donald Trump held an important rally in Miami, Florida last Monday, in which he once again threatened Venezuela with military intervention and called on the Venezuelan military to rise up against President Nicolás Maduro.
We seek a peaceful transition of power, but all options are open. We want to restore Venezuelan democracy, and we believe that the Venezuelan military and its leadership have a vital role to play in this process. If you choose this path, you have the opportunity to help forge a safe and prosperous future for all of the people of Venezuela. Or you can choose the second path, continuing to support Maduro. If you choose this path, you will find no safe harbor, no easy exit, and no way out. You will lose everything.
Meanwhile, Venezuela's self-proclaimed and so-called interim president, Juan Guaidó, announced that his parallel government will organize a humanitarian aid corridor from Colombia to Venezuela this coming Saturday on February 23rd. Joining me now to discuss Trump's most recent threats against Venezuela is Greg Grandin. Greg is professor of history at New York University and is the author of many books. He recently wrote an important article for the London Review of Books titled, "What is at Stake in Venezuela?" Thanks for joining us today, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So your article suggests that what's at stake in Venezuela is basically the concept of sovereignty, and you provide a history of the concept. As we saw from the clip of Trump's speech on Monday, he clearly did not give a moment's thought to the issue of Venezuelan sovereignty. Give us a brief rundown of how the concept evolved in Latin American history and how we got to where we are now, with Trump openly saying that a coup or U.S. military intervention in Venezuela are the only options left for Maduro.
Yeah, the idea of national sovereignty, right? That a country's leadership and constituted government have authority, monopoly authority over its people and territory it's an idea that has deep roots in Western thought, but it was really in Latin America, Spanish America, and Brazil where it was actualized after the wars of independence in the early 1800s. All of these republics, Spanish American republics, came into the world both challenged and legitimated by their neighboring countries. What came into the world was an already existing community of nations, a league of nations, and in order to survive, they had recognized that they needed to recognize the sovereignty of each other. Each country legitimated the other in the sense that they overthrew royal monarchical rule and claimed the right to independence, but they threatened each other because under the terms of international law, nations had the right to conquest and they had the right to wage war, an aggressive war, and keep territory that they obtained during military conquest. So they had to. So they set about revising international law, and it's a long story, but basically the concept of national sovereignty. It emerges in this context, but also vis-a-vis the United States. Not only did they have to contend with each other, all of these nations, Gran Colombia and Venezuela and Alto Peru and Chile and what became Argentina and Uruguay, they also had to contend with the United States. The United States was moving across the West like a whirligig, waging war on Mexico, soon to wage war on Spain to take Puerto Rico and Cuba. And so the Latin American jurists, politicians, and intellectuals deepened their commitment to the ideal of sovereignty. And they constantly tried to force the United States to accept that as a legitimate international law. The U.S. refused until 1933. 1933, there's an international conference in Montevideo, and just to make a long story short, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration conceded to Latin America's long-standing demand that they would not interfere in the internal or external affairs of other Western hemispheric nations. And rather than leading to a recession of U.S. power, this actually helped the United States find new multilateral ways of creating an international community where it could project its power free of the burdens of direct militarism and direct colonialism. And for decades, the ideal of sovereignty undergirded a kind of multilateral law and the international community, what became the United Nations, what became the Organization of American States. That begins to become undermined also in the in Latin America in the 1980s with the rise of the new right in the United States and the assault on Nicaragua. We can go through the list, all the turning points, but the invasion of Panama is an important turning point that undermines sovereignty. What I was trying to get at in that essay was that it's complicated. That it's frustrating that people don't know this. There are contradictions within the ideal of sovereignty. What do you do with a sovereign leader who is unjust to his own people? But the opposite is also true, right? Liberal interventionism in the name of some higher ideal obviously has created its own problems, as we see in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan.
I wanted to return to that in a moment, but before that, what would you say are the main reasons that the concept of sovereignty has eroded over the past few decades? That is, I would say especially since Nixon and Kissinger's overthrow of Chile's President Salvador Allende in 1973.
Yeah. Well, the thing about the Allende was a covert operation, so it wasn't a direct ideological assault on the concept of sovereignty. The United States intervened in Latin America through the Cold War during all of these periods, and they either did it covertly, where it didn't entail a legal revision of sovereignty, as in Chile in 1973, or they managed to corral the OAS, or in the case of Grenada in 1983, the Association of Eastern Caribbean Nations, into giving a multilateral stamp of approval on the intervention. It's really not till Panama that you see a full-on assault on the idea of sovereignty, even against, because the OAS was completely against the invasion of Panama. So to go back to your question, what begins to erode it is the demise of the Soviet Union, the ascension of the United States as a sole superpower, the beginning of the unraveling of the Keynesian political economic order, the rise of the human rights movement, the rise of the right to protect movement with international law, and you can look for causation, what's cause and what's effect of all of those things that account for the erosion of sovereignty. But there has been an undermining of the ideal. But it's still very precious, and in Latin America, right, for historical reasons, right, the left and beyond the left is still very committed to the ideal of national sovereignty.
Now, referring to that 1989 invasion of Panama, in order to get Manuel Noriega, you say that it had a transformative effect on international law, and actually, I think in your article, you suggest also that it paved the way for the invasion of Iraq. Now, do you think the effort to oust Maduro in Venezuela could pave the way for other interventions?
Well, certainly that's what Trump said it the other day, right? It's, in the queue is Cuba and Managua, and it's fairly clear at the same time that they're trying to build a coalition to raise the ante with Iran. I think there's lots of. This is a classic case in which it's an attempt to use a foreign policy crisis to reorder the international community. It's laying down a marker for China, laying down a marker for the Soviet Union. I mean, not for the Soviet Union, sorry. Laying down the marker for Russia. It's trying to marshal its new allies in Latin America, particularly Bolsonaro in Brazil and right-wing governments in Colombia and Argentina. At the same time, it's being used domestically to keep neoconservatives within the Trump coalition, keep Florida within the Trump coalition as we go to 2020, and it's also used to, create a kind of set the terms of the 2020 election. Foreign policy is, I like to say, foreign policy is the place where hegemony is created, not over other countries, but within this country. So you see when Trump immediately pivots from Venezuela to Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and says America will never be a socialist country, what he's doing is he's invoking a whole world view that has very deep resonance, and while at the same time laying out the terms of how he hopes to fight the 2020 campaign. So the Venezuela push is happening. There's lots of different levels in which it's taking place.
Now, finally, very quickly, it seems that the many governments in the Americas, especially the so-called Lima group of 12 conservative governments plus Canada, are wholeheartedly endorsing this re-edition of what one might call the reloaded Monroe Doctrine. And as you outline in your article, in the past, the governments of Latin America has mostly rejected U.S. assertion of a right to violate their sovereignty. Why do you think, or what do you think has changed that they would side with the U.S. now in the case of Venezuela?
Well, there has been the rollback of the red tide, right? The pink tide of the developmentalism that started with Chavez, that started with Aristide in some ways in Haiti. And so there's been a kind of complete pushback of all of that. I mean, it's not unprecedented. All of the OAS lined up with Washington to sequester Cuba, in the early 1960s. So there is a history of this. What is unique about it, I think, is the division, and that it's not all of Latin America. All of Latin America lined up against Cuba on the side of Washington back in the day. Now we're seeing some real divisions, and there's mostly Mexico, but Uruguay, Bolivia, and I think that's what's historically significant. That the United States has lost the ability it's regained the ability to kind of reassert its power via Monroe Doctrine-like coup attempts that don't even have the fig leaf of legitimacy in some ways. But on the other hand, it's doing it in a way that deepens divisionism within the region, which I think frankly could be dangerous. I mean, one of the things, for good or bad, about the United States and Latin America is that the United States tended to treat Latin America as a coherent region. It didn't play the politics of divide and rule that much for whatever reason. So therefore, there hasn't been a lot of interstate wars within Latin America. And so now we're seeing a kind of breakdown of that historical unification over Venezuela, which, who knows how it will play out in the long run.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there. I was speaking to Greg Grandin, professor of history at New York University. Thanks again, Greg, for having joined us today.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's great to be here.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.